Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. It all started a few months ago when I moved into this old Victorian house. I'd been looking for a place with character, something different from the sterile, cookie-cutter apartments I'd lived in before. This house was perfect, or so I thought. It was beautiful, standing at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by ancient oak trees that shaded the entire yard. The exterior was painted a soft, weathered blue with white trim. It had these big bay windows and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. Inside, the house was full of charm, original hardwood floors, ornate crown molding, and a massive attic that stretched across the entire top floor. The landlord had warned me that the house was old, with all the quirks and creaks that come with age. I didn't mind. In fact, I loved it. It felt alive, like it had a soul. Little did I know just how much history that house carried, or how much of it would refuse to stay in the past. I rented it alone, wanting some peace and quiet. After years of living with roommates and in busy apartment complexes, I was ready for solitude. I pictured myself curling up with a book by the bay window, sipping tea and enjoying the stillness. It felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of work and city life. But from the very first night, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a subtle unease, like the house was watching me, waiting for something. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself it was just nerves from moving into a new place. But looking back now, I realized that was when it started. This house wasn't just old, it was inhabited. The house was everything I had ever dreamed of. It looked like something straight out of a storybook, a grand old Victorian with ornate wooden banisters that curved gracefully up the staircase, stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the walls in the late afternoon sun, and ceilings so high they seemed to echo when I spoke. Every corner of the house felt steeped in history, as if it had witnessed lifetimes of stories long before I arrived. The attic, though, that was the piece to resistance. It stretched the entire length of the house, a cavernous space with low, slanted ceilings and wooden beams that crisscrossed like the bones of some ancient creature. The first time I climbed up there, I remember thinking how still it felt. Not quiet, exactly. There was the faint hum of the outside world, muffled and far away, but still, as if time itself had slowed down. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, soft and undisturbed, except for the footprints I made as I explored. Old, faded boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corners, their contents long forgotten. Cobwebs draped the beams like ghostly curtains, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp, like rust. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling gave off a weak, yellowish glow, barely reaching the corners of the attic. Shadows pooled in the edges of the room, deep and impenetrable. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but I couldn't help feeling like those shadows were watching me, pressing in closer the longer I stayed. I laughed it off, though. It was just an attic, after all, just an old, dusty room full of memories that weren't mine. Still, as I climbed back down the creaky ladder, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone up there. Moving into that house was supposed to be my fresh start. After years of living in the city, crammed into tiny apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors, I was desperate for some peace and quiet. Work had been relentless, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines and expectations. The house felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. It was just me. No roommates to argue over dishes with, no pets to take care of. Just me, the house, and the endless possibilities of solitude. Perfect, right? The first few days were bliss. I'd wake up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window, make a cup of coffee, and sit by the bay window, watching the sunlight dance through the stained glass. The house felt warm and inviting during the day, almost as if it were wrapping itself around me, welcoming me home. But at night, it was different. The first few nights I noticed little things, sounds mostly. At first, it was faint, just the occasional creak or groan from the old wooden floors. I told myself it was normal. The house was old, and old houses make noise. But then, the sound started to change. I'd be lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I'd hear a faint shuffling sound, like something moving above me. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like the sound of footsteps dragging across the attic floor. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe squirrels had found their way into the attic, or maybe it was just the wind rattling the house. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful. One night, I decided to check it out. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I climbed the attic ladder again. The moment I pushed open the hatch, the sound stopped. The attic was just as I had left it, dusty, quiet, and still. But as I shone my flashlight around the room, I could have sworn I saw something, a faint movement in the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, just shadows. But the feeling was back, that same heavy stillness, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I left the attic quickly that night, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I laughed at myself. I'd let my imagination get the better of me, that's all. It was a new house, a new routine. It was normal to feel unsettled at first. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The noises didn't stop. In fact, they got louder. Footsteps, whispers, the faint creak of floorboards directly above me. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard someone or something walking across the attic floor. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but I was starting to feel afraid. The house that had felt so warm and inviting during the day now felt cold and unfamiliar at night. And the attic, the space that had seemed so still and empty, was beginning to feel like the heart of something I couldn't explain. At first, it was easy to dismiss the oddities. A creak here, a shuffle there, what old house doesn't make noise at night? But over time, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. It started small. Late at night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I'd hear it faint whispering. It was so quiet I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably human. The sound didn't come from the walls or outside, it came from above me. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the old wood expanding and contracting with the cool night air. But deep down, I knew better. Then there were the objects. Items in the kitchen began to move, not in any dramatic, poltergeist-like fashion, but subtly. A cup I'd left on the counter would end up on the table. A drawer I knew I'd closed would be slightly ajar. And then there was the attic door. One morning, as I walked into the hallway, I noticed it. The attic door, which I hadn't opened since the first day I moved in, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to show a sliver of darkness between the frame and the hatch. My heart stopped for a moment. I told myself it must have been a draft, though I couldn't explain how. I pushed it closed and tried to forget about it. But the whispers continued. I couldn't take it anymore. I called a friend, Sarah, and I half joked about my haunted house. She laughed and said I was probably just tired and overthinking things. Old houses are like that, she said. They creak, they groan, and they mess with your head. It's just you in that big house, so your imagination is filling in the blanks. I laughed along with her, but it felt hollow. Her words made sense, but they didn't explain the whispers. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. That's when I heard it. Not just a creak this time, but something unmistakable, hurried footsteps. They were faint, but clear enough to tell they were coming from the attic. My blood turned to ice. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt more suffocating than the sound. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe I dreamed it. But the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger every day. Finally, I decided I had to face whatever was up there. I couldn't live with the constant fear, the endless whispers, and the creeping sensation that I was being watched. Armed with a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other, I made my way to the attic. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing in the silent house. The air grew colder with each step, a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. By the time I reached the top, my breath was visible in the dim light of the attic. I hesitated before pushing open the hatch, my heart racing. When I finally mustered the courage to lift it, the smell hit me first, stale, metallic, and slightly sweet, like old blood. The attic was just as I remembered, dusty and cluttered, with boxes piled haphazardly in the corners. But as my flashlight swept across the room, something caught my eye: a mattress. It was old and yellowed, stained with spots I didn't want to think too much about. Surrounding it were food wrappers, crumpled and torn as if someone had been living there. But it was the scratch marks that stopped me cold. Deep grooves had been carved into the wooden beams near the mattress, long and uneven, as if someone or something had been clawing at the wood in desperation. They stretched in every direction, some clustered together, others trailing off into the shadows. My throat tightened as the whispers started again, low and insistent, coming from somewhere deeper in the attic. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows that seemed to writhe and shift under the weak light. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if urging me to leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled back down the ladder, nearly dropping my flashlight in my haste. The attic door slammed shut behind me, and I shoved a chair under the handle, as if that could keep whatever was up there from coming down. My hands were trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I couldn't shake the image of the mattress, the food wrappers, the scratch marks. Someone had been living up there, or something worse. For a moment I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers had returned, louder and clearer than ever before, but they weren't just coming from one spot. They seemed to echo all around me, growing in intensity, circling me like an unseen predator. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam darting frantically across the attic. Shadows shifted and danced along the wooden beams, mocking my fear. Then, without warning, the attic door slammed shut. The sharp sound jolted me back to reality. I turned toward the ladder, panic surging through my veins. I stumbled forward, every instinct screaming at me to escape, but as I reached the edge, I felt it a force pulling me back. It wasn't a hand or a physical grip. It was cold, unnaturally cold, wrapping around my torso like a steel band. My breath caught in my throat, and I struggled against the invisible hold, but it was no use. The cold tightened, anchoring me in place. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. They weren't just sounds, they were voices, overlapping and indistinct, speaking a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, its beam casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. I couldn't see whatever was holding me, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow began to take shape. At first, it was formless, a dark smudge against the dimly lit attic. But as I watched, it grew, stretching and solidifying into something almost human. It was tall, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and angular like the twisted branches of a dead tree. Its head tilted to one side, as if studying me, the motion slow and deliberate. Its eyes, or rather, the empty voids where its eyes should have been locked onto me. They were hollow, black pits, but they radiated a malevolent energy that froze me to my core. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. I couldn't understand the words, but they resonated inside me, filling my mind with a crushing sense of despair and dread. Its grin was the worst of all. A jagged, unnatural curve that stretched far too wide across its face, as if it were mocking my fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my chest constricted. The air around me felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the cold that had held me in place now seemed to seep into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. With each step, the whispers grew louder, the air colder, the shadows darker. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought this was it. This was how it would end. But then, instinct took over. I remembered the baseball bat in my hand and swung it blindly, the motion fueled by sheer desperation. The bat connected with something solid, yet not. There was a sharp, guttural sound, almost like a hiss, and the cold grip around me loosened. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I stumbled toward the ladder, my legs shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. As I reached the edge, I felt the cold return, this time wrapping around my ankle. I kicked wildly, my foot connecting with something that sent another jolt of pain up my leg but freed me in the process. I half fell, half scrambled down the ladder, hitting the floor below with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. I didn't stop. I grabbed the edge of the attic door and slammed it shut with all my strength, my hands trembling as I shoved the nearby chair under the handle to keep it closed. For a moment there was silence. Then, the whispers returned, muffled but insistent, coming from the other side of the attic door. I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night air. My heart was pounding, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that house. I didn't go back for days. When I finally worked up the courage to return, I wasn't alone. I brought Sarah and a few others with me. But when we opened the attic door, everything was gone. The mattress, the scratch marks, even the food wrappers, they'd all vanished, as if none of it had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget what I felt. That night, I couldn't bear to stay in the house. My hands were still trembling as I called Sarah, asking if I could crash at her place. I didn't tell her everything, how could I? I just said I'd had a scare and needed somewhere to go. Sitting on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, I replayed the events over and over in my head. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its hollow, black eyes staring back at me. Every faint sound in her apartment, a faucet dripping, the hum of the fridge, made my chest tighten. The next day, I called the landlord. I didn't know what to say, so I just told him the basics, that I thought someone might have been living in the attic. He sounded skeptical, but he agreed to come over and check it out with me. When we arrived, I felt a mix of dread and relief. Dread at the thought of going back into that house, but relief that I wasn't alone this time. With the landlord leading the way, we climbed the attic ladder. What we found or didn't find shook me to my core. The mattress was gone. The wrappers, the scratch marks, every trace of what I'd seen just days before had vanished. The attic was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. The landlord gave me a strange look, half amused, half concerned. "Old houses can play tricks on you," he said, patting me on the shoulder. I wanted to argue, to tell him what I'd experienced, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the whispers? The cold, suffocating grip, the shadow with hollow eyes. I felt like I was losing my mind. I moved out a week later. I didn't care about the lease or the cost of breaking it. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house another night. Even now, I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just a squatter who'd somehow managed to slip away unnoticed, though that didn't explain the whispers or shadows. Or maybe it was something worse, something that can't be explained by logic or reason. All I know is that it left its mark on me. Every time I hear a creak in the floorboards or a whisper carried on the wind, my stomach knots up. I can't sleep without a light on, and I avoid attics entirely. Even when I'm in my own home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That house took something from me, my sense of safety, my peace of mind, and I don't think I'll ever get it back. If you ever hear whispers coming from a place they shouldn't be, don't ignore them. But don't convince yourself it's nothing, or tell yourself it's just your imagination. Because sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't just harmless noises. Sometimes they're real. And sometimes they're waiting for you to come closer. You know how they say your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, a place where you can let your guard down and feel safe. Well, after this experience, I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. It all started when I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment. I was fresh out of college and finally able to afford a place of my own. Living alone had always been a dream of mine. No roommates leaving dirty dishes in the sink, no shared schedules to juggle, just me in my own little space. The apartment was perfect. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. The walls were freshly painted, the floors were hardwood, and there was even a tiny balcony where I could sip coffee and read in the mornings. The second bedroom was small, but since I didn't need the extra space, I decided to use it for storage. I piled in all the boxes I didn't feel like unpacking and shut the door. Out of sight, out of mind. The neighborhood was quiet too. No loud neighbors, no barking dogs, just the occasional sound of cars passing by. After years of sharing crowded dorms and cramped apartments, this felt like heaven. At least it did at first. Looking back now, there were signs from the beginning, little things that should have tipped me off. Like how the second bedroom always felt colder than the rest of the apartment, or how the shadows in the hallway seemed to linger just a little too long. But I ignored them. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just getting used to living alone. I had no idea how wrong I was. The apartment was perfect, everything I could have hoped for in my first place on my own. It had this cozy charm that made it feel like home the moment I walked in. The walls were painted a soft cream that seemed to glow when the sunlight poured through the big windows. Hardwood floors stretched across every room, creaking ever so slightly underfoot in a way that felt comforting rather than unsettling. And then there was the balcony. It wasn't big, just enough for a small chair and a tiny table, but it quickly became my favorite spot. Every morning I'd sit out there with a steaming cup of coffee, letting the soft morning light wash over me while I listened to the quiet hum of the city waking up. The second bedroom, though, was a different story. It was smaller, tucked away at the end of the hallway. It had one narrow window that faced a brick wall, so almost no light ever came in. The room had a faint, musty smell, like it hadn't been aired out in years, and it always felt a little colder than the rest of the apartment. I didn't need the extra space, so I decided to use it as a storage room. I piled in the boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, old books, seasonal clothes, random things I didn't know what to do with, and shut the door. Out of sight, out of mind. For the first week, life in the apartment was bliss. I spent my days settling in, arranging furniture, and making the space my own. I cooked dinners in the little kitchen, watched my favorite shows on the couch, and spent lazy mornings on the balcony. It felt like my own little slice of heaven. What I loved most was the solitude. For the first time in years, I didn't have to share my space with anyone. No roommates leaving piles of dishes in the sink, no arguments over whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, just me, my apartment, and the freedom to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. After years of cramped dorms and shared living spaces, it was liberating. I could stay up as late as I wanted, play music as loud as I liked, or leave the laundry undone for days without anyone complaining. In the silence, it was beautiful. No one stomping around upstairs, no loud parties next door, just the occasional hum of traffic outside. It felt like the universe had gifted me a bubble of peace. But that peace didn't last. It started with small, almost unnoticeable things. One night I walked into the bathroom and found the light on. I distinctly remembered turning it off before bed, but I shrugged it off, figuring I must have forgotten. Then there were the creaks in the floorboards. At first I thought it was just the natural sounds of an old building settling. But these weren't random creaks. They were deliberate, like someone taking slow, measured steps. I told myself it was just the neighbors upstairs, even though the apartment directly above me was vacant. The little oddities didn't stop there. One morning I found my coffee mug on the counter, already filled with water. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to being half asleep and not remembering I'd done it. But then there were the noises. They came from the second bedroom, the one I'd turned into a storage room. At first, it was just a faint thud, like something thin inside. Maybe one of the boxes had tipped over, I thought. But then there were creaks, like the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper of movement. Soft enough that I could convince myself I was imagining it, but persistent enough that it gnawed at the edges of my mind. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard the door to the second bedroom creak open. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, straining to hear. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. In the morning, the door was closed. I told myself it must have been a draft. Old apartments make noise, I reminded myself. The building was settling. I repeated these reassurances like a mantra, clinging to them even as a part of me knew something wasn't right. But the noises didn't stop. And the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment, no matter how much I tried to deny it, kept growing stronger. At first, the noises were easy to brush off. Just faint rustling in the night, like the sound of old papers being shuffled. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft moving things around, or the natural sounds of an old building. But the sounds grew louder over time. They started creeping into my evenings. As I lay in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, I'd hear it. A soft rustling, like someone flipping through pages of a book, coming from the second bedroom. I'd sit up, straining to hear, but the moment I moved, the noise would stop. One night, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. The apartment was silent till I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the second bedroom door handle jiggling, as if someone was trying to open it. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for the door to creak open. But it didn't. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I turned on the light, expecting to see something, anything, but the hallway was empty, the door still shut. That's when other things started happening. Items in the apartment began to move. At first, it was subtle, a chair at the dining table pulled slightly away, as if someone had been sitting there. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, started showing up in strange places, the coffee table, the bathroom sink. And then there was my bedroom closet. I always kept it closed. Always. But one morning I woke up to find it slightly ajar. Just enough to see the dark space inside, the clothes hanging motionless. My stomach turned as I realized the door must have opened during the night while I was asleep. The thought of someone or something creeping through my room as I slept sent a chill down my spine. I checked the closet thoroughly, pulling back the clothes and peering into the corners, but it was empty. Still, the unease lingered. I called Sarah again, yes. The same Sarah who had heard all about the whispers in the attic in the first story. I tried to keep it lighthearted, joking about my unseen roommate. "You're just not used to living alone," she said, laughing. "You're probably noticing things you wouldn't if someone else were there." Her words made sense. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Living alone for the first time came with its own set of adjustments, right? But then, one night, I woke up to something I couldn't ignore. It was faint at first, barely audible, a soft humming. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was coming from outside. Maybe a neighbor was playing music, or someone had left a TV on. But no, the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the second bedroom. The humming was low and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. It sent a chill down my spine as I realized it wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate. Gripping my phone tightly, I crept down the hallway. Every step felt heavier, the air colder the closer I got to the second bedroom. The humming stopped the moment I touched the doorknob. I hesitated, my hand shaking as I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Boxes stacked neatly, nothing out of place. But the air was different, heavier, colder, like the room was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though there was no one there. I shut the door and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep that night. The breaking point came a few days later. I came home from work, tired and ready to collapse on the couch, when I saw it. The door to the second bedroom was wide open. I froze in the hallway, my keys still in my hand. I was certain I'd shut that door before leaving. The room looked different, even from the doorway. The boxes, which I'd stacked neatly when I moved in, had been shifted. They were arranged in a strange, almost deliberate pattern, like a spiral, twisting toward the center of the room. And in the middle of the spiral, lying on the floor, was a single piece of paper. It wasn't mine. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. It was covered in strange symbols written in a handwriting that looked jagged and uneven, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. I stepped into the room, my eyes darting between the spiral of boxes and the paper on the floor. The air felt icy, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. Then I heard it. A single, sharp breath right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My skin prickled, and the air seemed to press down on me, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed the paper, my hands trembling, and bolted out of the apartment without looking back. As I sat in my car, the paper resting on the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, that whatever was in that apartment had been watching me all along, waiting for me to notice it. And now it knew I had. The night after I found the paper in the second bedroom, I barely slept. My mind was a tangled mess of fear and questions. Who or what had left that paper? How did it know I'd find it? And why was it there? By the time darkness fell again, my nerves were shot. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, drew the curtains tightly shut, and left all the lights on. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. At first, the apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't faint or distant this time. They were heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable, moving steadily through the apartment. My blood ran cold. I froze, clutching my phone in one hand and a pillow in the other, as if that could somehow protect me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. Then came the knock. 3 soft, measured knocks. The sound was almost polite, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was giving me a chance to open the door willingly. My chest tightened as I stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. I didn't respond. I didn't breathe. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, the doorknob jiggled, the metal clicking as it twisted back and forth. The lock held. The lock held. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely think. And then it spoke. A low, raspy voice whispered from the other side of the door. This was my home. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my stomach drop. The voice sounded human, but wrong, like it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. Their vocal cords rusted and raw. I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved on instinct, fueled by sheer panic. I grabbed the closest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the door with all my strength. The crash echoed through the room, shattering the silence. And then, nothing. The voice stopped. The doorknob went still. I sat there, trembling, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to move. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. But the second bedroom door was open again. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment and never look back. But something, curiosity, defiance, or maybe sheer stupidity, pulled me toward that door. The air grew colder with every step, like walking into a freezer. When I reached the doorway, I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The spiral of boxes was gone. In its place stood a figure, a shadowy, human-like form, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its body too angular to be natural. It didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for me. Its head tilted slowly to one side, a deliberate, unnerving motion that sent a chill down my spine. It had no face, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and unrelenting. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder, overlapping and chaotic. They weren't coming from the figure, but from everywhere at once, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, slamming the apartment door behind me as I bolted down the hallway. My feet pounded against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was in my car, locking the doors and fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. As I drove away, I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. The thought of seeing that shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave, was too much to bear. The next morning, I called the landlord. My voice was shaky as I told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't offer an explanation, and he didn't ask for one. When I returned a few days later with a moving company to collect my belongings, the apartment felt different. The second bedroom was empty. No boxes, no paper, no signs that anyone or anything had ever been there. Even the faint, musty smell that had always lingered in the air was gone. I left that day and never looked back. I still don't know what I saw or what saw me, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't living alone. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I drove straight to Sarah's house, my hands trembling on the wheel, my mind replaying the events over and over. The sound of that voice, the shadowy figure in the second bedroom, the overwhelming sense that I'd been watched, none of it felt real, and yet it was all too vivid to dismiss. When I showed up at Sarah's door, she didn't even ask what was wrong. One look at my face, and she simply opened the door, let me in, and handed me a blanket. I collapsed onto her couch, clutching a cup of tea she'd made, but I didn't drink it. I just stared into the cup, trying to make sense of what had happened. For the next week, I stayed with Sarah. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in the apartment. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Sarah didn't laugh this time. She didn't tell me I was overreacting or imagining things. "What do you think it was?" she asked one night as we sat on her couch, the TV playing softly in the background. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've thought about it over and over. Maybe it was a squatter, someone who'd been living in the second bedroom all along, moving around when I wasn't home. Or maybe it was something else, something I can't explain." The idea of a squatter should have been the most rational explanation, but it didn't feel right. No human could explain the whispers, the cold air, the figure with no face. Eventually I had to go back. I couldn't avoid the apartment forever, but I didn't go alone. Sarah came with me, and we spent the entire day packing up my things. The second bedroom was empty when we got there. No boxes, no paper, no strange spirals or symbols. It was like nothing had ever happened. That was almost worse. The emptiness made me question everything. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined it all? But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd felt. And I knew I couldn't live there anymore. I broke the lease without a second thought. The landlord didn't seem surprised, and part of me wondered if I wasn't the first tenant to leave under strange circumstances. Since then, I've made a promise to myself. I won't live alone again. Even now, in a new place, with people around me, I can't sleep without checking every closet, every door, every shadow. I've installed extra locks, cameras, and motion detectors. I tell myself it's just precaution, but the truth is I'm still scared. Every creak, every faint sound, every misplaced item sends a jolt of fear through me. The memory of that voice, that figure in the second bedroom, lingers like a shadow I can't shake. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. If you ever feel like you're not alone in your own home, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts. Sometimes the things we can't see are the ones we should fear the most. Because what's more terrifying than a monster in the dark? A monster that's already inside, sharing your space, waiting for you to notice it. So, if you ever hear footsteps in an empty room, or find something moved that shouldn't be, don't laugh it off. Don't brush it aside. Pay attention. Sometimes the unseen roommate isn't just in your head. And sometimes they don't want to leave. It was supposed to be just another lazy summer afternoon. My friends and I were out exploring the woods near our hometown when we found an old, abandoned tunnel carved into the side of a hill, hidden behind a wall of vines and overgrowth. At first it seemed like a harmless curiosity, a relic of some bygone era begging to be explored. We thought it would be fun, an adventure to break the monotony of the summer. But the deeper we went, the more we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. What started as an innocent hike turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. This happened a few summers ago, back when I was 18. It was the kind of summer you only get once, the last stretch of freedom before adulthood, college, and all the responsibilities that come with growing up. I was spending the break with my best friends, Sam, Mia, and Jack. We'd grown up together in a small town surrounded by dense woods and old, forgotten trails. Those woods had been our playground for as long as I could remember, full of hidden creeks, towering trees, and the occasional rusty piece of junk left behind by whoever lived there before us. By the time we were teenagers, we'd explored most of it, or so we thought. We knew every trail, every clearing, every secret spot worth knowing. Or at least we thought we did. That summer, we were always looking for something new to do. We'd already gone swimming in the river, camped out in the backyard, and spent countless hours driving aimlessly around town, listening to music and complaining about how boring everything was. So when we stumbled across the entrance to that tunnel, it felt like fate, like the adventure we'd been waiting for. It was Sam who found it first. We were hiking along a rarely used trail, one that cut through the thickest part of the woods, when he spotted something behind a tangle of vines. At first, we thought it was just a rock face, but as we pushed the vines aside, we realized it was an archway, a dark, gaping hole carved into the earth. The bricks lining the arch were crumbling with age, their surfaces slick with moss and grime. Above the entrance was a rusted metal plaque, the lettering so worn it was almost illegible. We spent a few minutes scraping away the dirt, and when we stepped back, we could just barely make out the words, Railway Maintenance Tunnel. It was Sam's idea to go inside. He was always the adventurous one, the one who pushed us to try things we wouldn't have done on our own. Mia was hesitant. "It doesn't look safe," she said, her arms crossed as she stared into the darkness. Jack laughed. "It's just an old tunnel. What's the worst that could happen?" I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me was curious this was something new, something we'd never seen before. But another part of me, a quieter, more instinctive part, felt uneasy. The air coming out of the tunnel was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. It didn't smell like rust, though. It smelled wrong. But in the end, curiosity won out. It always does. We grabbed the flashlights from our backpacks, stepped over the crumbling threshold, and walked into the darkness. We thought we were ready for anything. We couldn't have been more wrong. It was the kind of summer day that felt endless hot, bright, and lazy, with just enough breeze to make the heat bearable. The four of us had been hiking since late morning, cutting through the deeper parts of the woods on a trail that barely anyone used anymore. The trail twisted and turned, overgrown with thorny bushes and surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sky. We'd been exploring the woods for years, ever since we were kids, but this time we decided to try something new, a path none of us had taken before. I remember thinking the forest seemed different that day, quieter somehow. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were muted, replaced by an eerie stillness. But I didn't say anything. I figured it was just my imagination. And then we found it. The entrance was hidden behind a wall of overgrown vines and shrubs. Sam was the one who spotted it first, his eyes catching on something unusual behind the greenery. At first, we thought it was just a rock face or a natural cave, but as we cleared away the vines, the truth began to emerge. It wasn't a cave. It was a tunnel. The entrance was wide and arched, lined with crumbling brick that had turned dark with age and dampness. The air that seeped out was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that reminded me of blood. Above the archway, a rusted metal plaque was bolted into the stone. Most of the lettering had worn away, but after a few minutes of brushing off the dirt and rust, we managed to make out 3 words: Railway Maintenance Tunnel. "What do you think is down there?" Jack asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "Only one way to find out," Sam said, grinning. He was always the adventurous one, the first to try anything new and the last to back down from a challenge. He stepped toward the entrance, his flashlight already in hand. "Come on," he said, glancing back at us. "How often do you find something like this?" Mia hesitated, crossing her arms. "It doesn't look safe," she said, eyeing the dark opening warily. Jack, ever the comedian, laughed nervously. "What's the worst that could happen? We find some bats. Maybe a couple of ghosts." I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me was excited this was the kind of discovery we'd always dreamed of as kids. But another part of me, the part that paid attention to the chill in the air and the way the light seemed to die just inside the tunnel, felt uneasy. But curiosity is a powerful thing. In the end, we all followed Sam. The 4 of us had been inseparable for as long as I could remember. Sam was the leader, the one who always came up with the craziest ideas and convinced the rest of us to go along with them. He had this infectious energy that made it hard to say no, even when you knew his plans were probably a bad idea. Mia was the voice of reason, the cautious one who always tried to keep us out of trouble. She was the one who packed extra water bottles and Band-Aids, who made sure we had a plan in case something went wrong. But even she wasn't immune to Sam's charm. She usually gave in eventually, even if it meant grumbling the whole way. Jack was the comedian, the one who could lighten the mood no matter how tense things got. He always had a joke ready, even if it wasn't funny, and he had a way of making us laugh even when we didn't want to. And then there was me. I was the quiet observer, the one who always got pulled along for the ride. I didn't mind, though I liked being part of the group, even if I wasn't the one leading the charge. We thought we knew each other inside and out, that there was nothing we couldn't handle as long as we stuck together. But that tunnel, it showed us things we weren't ready to see, not in the world, and not in ourselves. The first few feet inside the tunnel felt harmless enough. Our flashlights illuminated walls slick with moss and streaked with water that dripped from the ceiling. The floor was uneven, littered with debris, rusted tools, scraps of wood, and old rotting railroad ties. It was clear no one had been down there in decades. We walked in single file, our footsteps echoing in the darkness. At first, the echoes sounded normal, but as we went deeper, they began to sound off, distorted, like the tunnel was twisting the sound into something else. "It's colder in here," Mia said, hugging herself. She was right. The further we went, the colder the air became, as if we were descending into a cave. The chill seeped into my skin, making me shiver despite the heat outside. At one point, Mia stopped abruptly, her flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Sam asked, turning to look at her. "Breathing," she said. It sounded like someone breathing behind us. We all turned our flashlights toward the entrance, but there was nothing there, just the empty tunnel stretching back into the light. "It's just your imagination," Sam said, though his voice sounded less certain than usual. We laughed it off, but the mood had shifted. Sam tried to lighten the atmosphere by making ghost jokes, and Jack played along, pretending to be scared. But I could tell they were just as uneasy as the rest of us. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, as if the tunnel itself didn't want us there. My flashlight flickered once, then twice, before steadying again, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But we didn't. We kept moving forward, our laughter fading into silence as the darkness closed in around us. Something about the tunnel felt wrong, like we were intruding on a place that wasn't meant to be found. The tunnel seemed endless, a dark, winding passage burrowing deeper into the earth. At first, it felt like every other abandoned place we'd explored over the years, forgotten, decaying, and harmless. The walls were streaked with grime, the floor uneven and littered with debris. Old, rusted tracks ran along the center of the tunnel, broken in places and overgrown with moss. Graffiti covered the bricks, crude drawings and names scrawled in fading paint. It was exactly what you'd expect from a place that hadn't been used in decades. But as we moved further in, things began to change. The air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of our faces. The faint metallic tang we'd noticed at the entrance became stronger, sharper, like rust mixed with something else, something foul and organic. And then there were the lanterns. They were old, their metal frames corroded and barely clinging to the walls. At first, I thought they were long dead, but as our flashlights swept over them, I saw faint, flickering light inside. It wasn't bright, just a soft glow, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. "Why are they still lit?" Mia whispered, her voice shaky. "They're not," Sam said quickly. "It's just a trick of the light." But even he didn't sound convinced. The graffiti began to change, too. The further we went, the less it looked like typical vandalism. The shapes became more intricate, swirling patterns and jagged lines that didn't form any language I recognized. Mia stopped in front of one particularly large carving, running her fingers over the grooves in the brick. "This isn't graffiti," she said. "It's too precise." "Maybe it's some kind of old code," Jack offered, but his usual humor was gone. His voice was tight, his eyes darting nervously around the tunnel. Then we found the belongings. Piles of clothes and personal items, scattered along the edges of the tunnel like someone had dropped them in a hurry. There were shoes torn and caked with mud, and backpacks so old the fabric had begun to disintegrate. "Where are the people who left these?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The further we went, the heavier the air became, as if the tunnel itself was alive, pressing down on us. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering for a moment before steadying. I tried to tell myself it was just the batteries, but the humming in the air told me otherwise. "It's getting weird," Mia said, stopping in her tracks. "We should turn back." "We've come this far," Sam argued, his voice firm but edged with unease. "We can't stop now." And then we found the door. It was set into the side of the tunnel, almost hidden in the shadows. At first I thought it was part of the wall, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was something else entirely. The door was massive, made of thick iron that was corroded and streaked with rust. Rivets lined the edges, and the surface was covered in deep scratches, as if something or someone had tried to claw their way through it. There was no handle, no visible way to open it, It looked ancient, like it had been there long before the tunnel was built. "What do you think's behind it?" Jack asked, his voice wavering despite the grin he forced onto his face. "Treasure," Sam said, but his usual confidence was gone. We searched the surrounding area for clues, shining our flashlights over the walls and floor. That's when Mia found the journal. It was wedged into a crevice in the wall, its cover damp and falling apart. The pages inside were water-stained and barely legible, but we could still make out enough to piece together the story. The journal belonged to someone named E. Kellaway, a worker assigned to the tunnel decades ago. At first, the entries were mundane notes about repairs, supply orders, and the occasional grumble about the long hours. But as we flipped through the pages, the tone changed. "The sounds are getting louder," one entry read. "I don't think I'm alone down here." Another entry, "The others have disappeared. I'm the only one left. I keep hearing whispers behind the door." The final entry was the most chilling. The handwriting was frantic, the words smeared as if the writer's hand had slipped in panic. "Whatever's in there, it's hungry." We didn't stay in the tunnel much longer after that. The air felt heavier than ever, and the faint hum had grown into a low vibration we could feel in our chests. By the time we made it back to the entrance, the sun had set and the woods were bathed in shadow. We sat around the tunnel's mouth, trying to make sense of what we'd found. "Do you think it's real?" Mia asked, holding the journal tightly in her hands. "It has to be," I said. "Why else would someone leave it behind?" "Maybe it's a hoax," Jack suggested, but he didn't sound like he believed it. As we debated, a sound echoed from deep within the tunnel. Footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her face pale. We grabbed our flashlights and pointed them toward the darkness, but the beams barely penetrated the void. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and misshapen, its body covered in what looked like decayed, rotting flesh. Its eyes, or what was left of them, glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator's. For a moment it just stood there, swaying slightly, as if studying us. Then it let out a low, guttural sound that made my stomach turn. "Run," Sam shouted, scrambling to his feet. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted into the woods, the figure's guttural sounds echoing behind us. I didn't dare look back, and I could hear Mia's ragged breaths as she struggled to keep up. By the time we reached the safety of the clearing, the sounds had stopped, but the terror lingered. None of us spoke as we hurried back to the car. Whatever was in that tunnel, we knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. The figure didn't hesitate. The moment we bolted, it came after us, its footsteps pounding against the tunnel floor with terrifying force. The sound was deafening, each step echoing off the walls like a drumbeat of doom. It wasn't just fast, it was relentless, its movements unnatural and jerky, as if it didn't have full control of its own body. The walls of the tunnel seemed to press closer, the space growing tighter with every step we took. The air was thick and foul, reeking of decay and something metallic, something that made my stomach churn. "Don't stop," Sam yelled, his voice hoarse as he sprinted ahead of us. I wanted to look back, to see how close the thing was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I focused on the narrow beam of my flashlight, bobbing wildly as I ran. The ground was uneven, littered with debris, and every step threatened to send me sprawling. And then the whispers started. At first they were faint, like a breeze brushing against my ears, but they grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic symphony of voices. They weren't speaking any language I could understand, but their tone was unmistakable, taunting, malicious, full of hunger. Mia stumbled ahead of me, her flashlight clattering to the ground. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back to her feet, and we kept running. Jack was just ahead of us, his breaths ragged as he shouted for us to keep moving. The tunnel felt endless, the entrance a distant, unreachable point of light. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps behind us grew faster, heavier, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. The thing wasn't just chasing us, it was gaining on us. As we neared the entrance, the light growing brighter with each step, the figure let out a guttural sound, deep, rumbling and inhuman. It reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the walls and making my teeth ache. Then it lunged. It moved so fast that I barely registered it, a blur of shadows and decay that closed the distance in an instant. Its hand, or what was left of it, snatched Sam by the back of his shirt, yanking him off his feet and dragging him toward the darkness. "Sam!" Mia screamed, her voice cracking with panic. I skidded to a halt, turning just in time to see Sam thrashing against the thing's grip. Its other hand reached for him, long, jagged fingers curling around his arm. The glow of its eyes burned in the darkness, twin orbs of cold, malevolent light. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. Its body was twisted and wrong, its skin peeling away in places to reveal sinew and bone. Sam screamed, his voice echoing down the Lennel, raw and filled with terror. For a moment I thought we'd lost him, that the thing would drag him into the shadows and we'd never see him again. But then Sam did something I'll never forget. With one desperate, furious motion, he twisted his body and slammed the flashlight in his hand against the creature's face. The light shattered, sending shards of plastic flying, but the impact was enough to make the thing let go. Sam stumbled forward, his shirt torn and his face pale with terror. "Run," he shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the entrance, the figure's guttural growls echoing behind us. I could feel it watching us, its glowing eyes boring into the back of my skull. We burst out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the forest floor in a heap. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. Mia was beside me, clutching her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. Jack stood a few feet away, his hands on his knees, his face as pale as a ghost. Sam was the last to emerge, stumbling out of the tunnel and collapsing onto the ground. His hands were shaking, his eyes wide and unfocused. We sat there in stunned silence, too terrified to speak. The entrance to the tunnel loomed behind us, dark and foreboding, the whispers still faintly audible from deep within. And then the figure appeared again. It stood at the mouth of the tunnel, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It didn't step outside, it didn't need to. It just stood there, its misshapen body half hidden in the shadows, watching. And then, as if deciding we weren't worth the effort, it stepped back. The shadows swallowed it whole, and the whispers faded into silence. None of us spoke as we made our way back through the woods. The adrenaline that had kept us going was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a lingering sense of dread. I glanced back once, just once, to make sure the figure wasn't following us. The entrance to the tunnel was barely visible through the trees, but it felt like it was watching us, even from a distance. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car. As we drove away, no one said a word. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of trees in the wind. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's glowing eyes, heard its guttural growl, felt the suffocating weight of the air in the tunnel. I still don't know what it was or why it let us go. But I do know one thing: I'll never go back to that tunnel. We never spoke about what happened that night, not to our parents, not to anyone. The moment we reached town, we made an unspoken pact to leave it behind. It wasn't a conversation we had out loud. It was something we all just understood. We didn't want to relive it. We didn't want to explain it. We didn't even want to acknowledge it. We swore to never go back to the tunnel, to pretend it didn't exist. At first, it wasn't hard to keep that promise. The memory of that night was too raw, too vivid. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing eyes of the figure, heard the whispers echoing through the darkness, and felt the suffocating weight of its presence. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the edges of the memory began to blur. The terror I'd felt in that moment was replaced by a nagging curiosity. What was behind that door? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The journal we found the warnings about the sounds, the whispers. The hunger kept playing over and over in my mind. Was it all just the ramblings of someone who had been alone in the darkness too long? Or was it something worse? I tried to push the questions away, to focus on moving forward. But the tunnel had a way of creeping back into my thoughts when I least expected it. I started dreaming about it, dreams so vivid they felt like memories. In the dreams, I was back in the tunnel, standing in front of the door. But instead of turning away, I opened it. I never saw what was on the other side. The dreams always ended the same way, with the door creaking open, a rush of freezing air, and the sound of whispers growing louder and louder until they were deafening. And then I'd wake up, my heart pounding, the air in my room feeling too cold, too still. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed just a little longer, if we'd tried harder to open the door. I wonder if the thing we saw was the only one. And I wonder if it ever left that tunnel, or if it's still there, waiting for someone else to stumble across its hiding place. If there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's this. If you ever stumble across something that feels wrong, something hidden, forgotten, and meant to stay that way, walk away. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Don't convince yourself that it's just an adventure, that it's harmless, that it's nothing. Because some things are better left undiscovered. There's a reason certain places are forgotten, a reason certain doors are sealed shut, a reason some things are buried so deeply they're never meant to be found. Trust your instincts. If a place feels off, if the air feels heavier, if the silence feels too deep, if the shadows feel too alive, leave. You might never know what you've avoided, but I promise you, it's better that way. I was in high school, 16 or 17, I think, when it happened. Our class was going on an overnight trip to an old, historic lodge deep in the woods. It was one of those places that had been around for over a century, originally built as a hunting lodge for the wealthy, and later converted into a sort of educational retreat. The trip was supposed to be about exploring local history and nature. We'd hike, do some team building exercises, and learn about the lodge's past. The teachers made it sound like an amazing opportunity to bond with our classmates and experience something different from our usual routines. When we first heard about it, we were all excited. A weekend away from school, no homework, no parents, just us in the woods. It sounded perfect. But looking back now, I wish we'd never gone. The lodge itself was beautiful on the outside. Nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, it looked like something out of a storybook. Its dark wooden walls and high-pitched roof gave it a rustic, almost cozy vibe. And when we arrived, everything seemed normal. But normal doesn't always mean safe. What none of us knew, what none of the teachers bothered to mention, was the lodge's history. I learned later that it had a reputation, one that wasn't in any of the brochures. A reputation for strange occurrences, for people hearing things, seeing things, and even disappearing. At the time, though, none of that mattered. We were too busy joking around, unpacking our things, and planning how we'd sneak snacks into our rooms after lights out. It wasn't until the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the clearing, that I started to feel it. A heaviness in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. I wish I'd trusted that feeling, but instead I ignored it, just like everyone else. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The lodge was breathtaking, a place that seemed untouched by time. As the buses pulled into the gravel driveway, the first thing that struck me was how isolated it was. Towering pine trees surrounded the clearing, their branches swaying gently in the cool breeze. In the distance, the glassy surface of a lake shimmered under the fading sunlight. And then there was the lodge itself. It was massive, a sprawling, three-story structure made of dark, weathered wood. The steeply pitched roof and wide wraparound porch gave it an almost gothic charm. It looked like something out of a postcard or a horror movie, depending on your perspective. When we arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the clearing. The fading light made the lodge look even more imposing, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of unease. The teachers herded us off the buses, and as we stood in a cluster, staring up at the building, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant lapping of water against the shore. Inside, the lodge was even more impressive. The main hall was enormous, with vaulted ceilings held up by thick wooden beams. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with ashes from fires long since extinguished. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white images of the lodge and its visitors from the early 1900s. There were hallways stretching out from the main hall in every direction, each one lined with doors that led to small, shared rooms with bunk beds. The rooms were cozy but sparse, bare wooden floors, simple furniture, and the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. Despite its beauty, there was something about the place that felt off. Maybe it was the way the hallways seemed darker than they should have been, even with the lights on. Or maybe it was the strange silence that settled over the group as we explored. Still, we brushed it off. After all, we were just a bunch of teenagers excited to be away from school for the weekend. This was supposed to be fun, a little freedom, some team-building activities, and a chance to bond with our classmates. There were about 20 of us on the trip, plus 2 teachers, Mr. Harris and Ms. Clark. Mr. Harris was the kind of teacher who tried too hard to be funny, while Ms. Clark was stricter, always keeping an eye on us to make sure no one got into trouble. My best friend Alex and I were rooming together. Alex was the kind of guy who could make light of any situation, which was part of the reason we got along so well. He had this knack for turning everything into a joke, which I appreciated most of the time. The room we shared was small but functional. 2 bunk beds, a small dresser, and a single window that overlooked the clearing. The wooden floor creaked with every step, and the air felt damp, like the room hadn't been used in years. "Quaint," Alex said with a grin as he tossed his bag onto the bottom bunk. "It's something," I replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. The rest of the group was a mix of classmates some I knew well, others I barely spoke to. There was Jess, who was always cracking sarcastic jokes, and Mark, who seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. Everyone was excited, though, laughing and chatting as we settled in. The first night started out fine. We had dinner in the main hall, basic cafeteria food, but we didn't care. Afterward, we played some icebreaker games organized by Mr. Harris, who seemed determined to make the trip as fun as possible. At one point, he gave a long-winded speech about the history of the lodge. He talked about how it had been built over a century ago as a hunting retreat for wealthy families, then converted into a lodge for travelers in the 1920s. He mentioned something about its unique history, but he didn't go into much detail. As the evening wore on, the energy in the room began to wind down. One by one, we started heading to our rooms, tired from the long day. It was on the way back to our room that I first noticed something strange. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the kind of hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. As I walked, I thought I heard faint whispers. At first, I assumed it was just other students in their rooms, but when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The whispers stopped as soon as I stopped moving. When I told Alex about it, he laughed. "You're just spooking yourself," he said. "It's an old building. Of course it makes weird noises." Maybe he was right. But as I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the creaks and groans of the lodge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. A faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway, or maybe the room next door. I sat up, my heart pounding, but the sound was gone. Alex was already snoring softly in the bunk below me, completely oblivious. I wanted to wake him, to tell him what I'd heard, but I stopped myself. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, "just the wind." Still, it took a long time to fall asleep that night. And even when I finally did, my dreams were restless. Dreams of dark hallways, shifting shadows, and whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The next morning, we divided into small groups to explore the area surrounding the lodge. It was supposed to be an educational activity, get some fresh air, learn about the local history and ecology, and bond with classmates. My group included Alex, Jess, Mark, and Ms. Clark. The trail we were assigned to follow wound through the dense forest behind the lodge, a narrow dirt path flanked by towering trees. At first, the hike was peaceful. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. It was the kind of serene environment you'd see in a nature documentary. We walked in pairs, chatting and laughing as we made our way deeper into the woods. Even Mark, who had been grumbling about the trip since we arrived, seemed to relax a little. But as the trail stretched on, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, carrying a dampness that clung to our skin. The sunlight that had seemed so warm and inviting earlier now barely filtered through the trees, leaving us in a dim, gray haze. And the forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, grew unnervingly quiet. No bird song, no insects buzzing, nothing but the crunch of our footsteps on the path. "This is creepy," Jess whispered, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Alex tried to lighten the mood. "Relax, it's just a quiet patch. Probably scared the animals off with all our talking." But even he didn't sound convinced. The trail ended abruptly at a small, overgrown clearing. In the center stood the remains of a building, an old wooden structure, its walls sagging and covered in moss. The roof had partially caved in, and vines snaked through the broken windows. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Ms. Clark stepped forward, brushing aside a low-hanging branch. "It's probably a caretaker's cabin. Back when the lodge was first built, places like this often had someone who lived on the grounds year-round to maintain the property." "Looks more like a haunted house," Jess muttered, earning a nervous laugh from Mark. Despite our unease, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look. Inside, the cabin was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, what might have once been a table, a chair, a wooden chest, now reduced to splinters. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols etched deep into the wood, their meanings indecipherable. "Probably graffiti," Alex said, but his voice was quieter than usual, and his eyes lingered on the carvings longer than they should have. As we explored, Jess stumbled upon a small, rusted metal box buried beneath a pile of debris. She pried it open, revealing a collection of old photographs inside. The pictures were black and white, faded with age, and showed groups of people standing in front of the lodge. At first glance, they seemed normal men, women, and children dressed in early 1900s clothing, smiling for the camera. But as we flipped through the photos, something caught our attention. In every single picture, there was a figure standing in the background. Tall, shadowy, and barely distinguishable, the figure seemed to blend into the trees behind the lodge. Its presence was subtle at first, almost easy to miss, but the more we looked, the more obvious it became. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Probably just a trick of the light," Alex said, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than the rest of us. Jess let out a nervous laugh. "Right, a trick of the light in every single photo." We stared at the photographs in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over us like a heavy blanket. "Let's head back," Ms. Clark said finally, her tone more clipped than usual. She led the way out of the cabin and we followed, none of us saying a word as we retraced our steps to the lodge. That night, back at the lodge, things got worse. After dinner, we gathered in the main hall to play cards and tell stories. The teachers sat at one of the tables, chatting quietly, while the rest of us tried to pretend that everything was normal. But the atmosphere in the lodge felt different, heavier, darker. It started with the lights. At first they flickered, just for a second, enough to make everyone glance up nervously. Then it happened again, and again. "Old wiring," Mr. Harris said with a chuckle, trying to ease the tension, but his laugh sounded forced. The flickering continued until, suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. A few people screamed, but most of us just froze, unsure of what to do. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of someone fumbling with their phone for a flashlight. When the lights finally came back on, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. But then Mark pointed at the door. "Why is that open?" We all turned to look. The main door to the hall, the one we'd locked earlier, was wide open. And standing in the doorway was a figure. Tall, thin, and shadowy, just like in the photographs. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence sending a wave of cold terror through the room. "Who's there?" Mr. Harris called out, his voice wavering. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. The door slammed shut with a force that made the walls shake. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the whispers started. Faint, overlapping voices coming from somewhere deep within the lodge. And we knew, without a doubt, that we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events from the day, the photographs, the figure in the doorway played over and over in my mind. Every creak of the lodge's old wooden floorboards, every faint gust of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. I kept telling myself it was just the building settling, just the sounds of nature outside, but I didn't believe it. Around midnight, as I lay in my bunk staring at the dark ceiling, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't faint or distant this time. They were heavy, deliberate, moving slowly down the hallway outside our room. My heart pounded as I nudged Alex awake. "What is it?" he whispered groggily. "Listen," I hissed. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each step echoed down the hallway, the sound of old wood groaning under the weight of something or someone. Alex sat up, his eyes wide. We both stared at the door, neither of us daring to move. The footsteps stopped just outside our room. Then came the knock. 3 soft, measured knocks. The sound was so precise, so deliberate, that it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't frantic or hurried, it was calm, almost polite, like whoever or whatever was on the other side knew we were listening. Alex and I exchanged a terrified glance. I could barely hear him breathing, and I wasn't sure I was breathing myself. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until the doorknob began to jiggle. It wasn't frantic, but slow and methodical, as if the thing outside was testing the lock, trying to find a way in. And then, the door creaked open. We hadn't locked it. I cursed myself for the oversight, but there was no time for regret. The door swung open just enough to reveal the hallway beyond, and a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its head tilted to one side, as if studying us. Its body was dark, almost shadow-like, but solid enough to block out the dim light from the hallway. It didn't have a face, at least, not one I could make out, but I felt its gaze cold and piercing, as if it was looking straight through me. And then it whispered something. The voice was low and raspy, barely more than a breath, and the words were in a language I didn't understand, but the sound of it made my skin crawl, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Before we could react, the figure lunged forward. Its movements were sudden and unnatural, jerky yet impossibly fast, like a puppet being yanked on strings. I grabbed the edge of the bunk, too terrified to move, but Alex reacted faster. "Run," he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me off the bed. We bolted for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We sprinted down the hallway, the floorboards creaking and groaning under our weight. Behind us, I could hear the faint sound of whispers, overlapping and chaotic, like a chorus of voices chasing us. "Wake up! Wake up!" Alex shouted, pounding on doors as we ran. One by one, other students stumbled out of their rooms, confused and groggy. Some of them asked what was going on, but most just stared at us, wide-eyed as we shouted for them to follow us. The figure didn't chase us. It just stood at the end of the hallway, watching, its head tilted again, almost as if it were amused by our panic. When we reached the main hall, the lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for a moment before they sputtered back on. By then, everyone was awake, the room filled with nervous whispers and frantic questions. "What's going on?" Jess demanded, her voice trembling. "It's here," Alex said, his voice shaking. "The thing from the photos, it's real." Before anyone could respond, one of the teacher's M's, Clark, raised her voice. "That's enough," she said, trying to calm us down. "Everyone stay here, we'll sort this out." But her voice lacked conviction, and I could see the fear in her eyes. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the main hall, too afraid to return to our rooms. The teachers tried to reassure us, insisting that the flickering lights and the open door could be explained, but they avoided talking about the figure. By the time the sun rose, we were all packed and ready to leave. The buses arrived earlier than planned, and the teachers didn't protest when we all piled on, eager to get as far away from the lodge as possible. On the drive back, the teachers dismissed the events as group hysteria. "You all scared yourselves," Mr. Harris said, though he looked as shaken as the rest of us. The power outage, the open door, it was all just a coincidence. But we knew better. Alex and I didn't talk much on the way home. When we finally did, it was only to confirm what we'd both seen: the figure standing in the doorway, the sound of its voice, and the way it had just disappeared. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't our imagination. It was real. To this day, I don't know what we encountered on that trip. I've gone over the events in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of them, trying to find a logical explanation. Was it tied to the lodge's history? Maybe the figure was connected to the old photographs, a remnant of the past that refused to let go. Or maybe it had something to do with the cabin in the woods, with its strange carvings and eerie silence. But part of me wonders if it was something older, something that had always been there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, watching, waiting. There are too many unanswered questions. Why did it show itself to us? Why was it in those photos, always in the background, blending into the trees? And most importantly, why didn't it follow us when we left? I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that the experience changed me. It left a mark, an unease that I can't shake no matter how much time has passed. I don't go on trips like that anymore. I don't camp, I don't hike, and I certainly don't stay in old, isolated buildings, even when I'm in the safety of my own home. I find myself checking the corners of the room, glancing over my shoulder, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. That trip taught me something I can never unlearn. Not every place is meant to be visited. Some places carry a weight, a history, that isn't meant for us to uncover. One thing's for sure, I'll never go back to that lodge. Not for any reason. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, trust your instincts. It might be a whisper of unease, a chill in the air, or a sense that you're being watched. Whatever it is, don't ignore it. Our instincts exist for a reason. They're a warning, a signal that something isn't right. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes it's waiting for you. The things we can't explain, the shadows that move in the corner of your eye, the faint whispers in an empty room are real. Maybe not in the way we understand, but real enough to leave a scar. So if you ever hear footsteps when no one's there, or find yourself staring into the darkness of a hallway that seems too quiet, listen to that feeling. Don't dismiss it. Because sometimes the places we think are empty are anything but. And sometimes they don't want us to leave. Thank you for listening to my stories. If you've ever experienced something similar, I'd love to hear about it. And remember, trust your instincts. They might just save you.